As you might already know, in the past couple of days, Trump has, once again, turned his attention towards Greenland, arguing that the US needs to essentially annex the territory and refusing to rule out using military force to do so. This has left European leaders open-mouthed, despite a strong-worded joint statement from Macron, Merz, Meloni, Tusk, Sanchez and Frederiksen on Tuesday, warning that Greenland belongs to its people. In an interview with the New York Times, published on Thursday, Trump once again reiterated his intention to annex the territory, arguing that the current arrangement with Denmark wasn't sufficient, and the US actually needs to own the territory outright. So in this video, we're going to ask, given that strongly worded statements clearly aren't sufficient, what else Europe could do to deter or retaliate against an American annexation of Greenland. If you love staying informed and want some of the best reporting on YouTube, then subscribe and ring the bell for more. So, there are sort of two questions here. First, if Trump does try to seize Greenland, should Europe retaliate at all? And second, if Europe does decide to retaliate, what form should this retaliation take? Let's start with the first question. Should Europe retaliate at all? Now, you might be thinking, of course Europe should retaliate against an attack on sovereign territory. But at least some European leaders are wary of picking a fight over Greenland, even if Trump does use military force to seize the territory. This is mainly because they want to keep Trump on side to avoid a sudden withdrawal of US support for Ukraine, especially when peace negotiations are ongoing and when Trump seems to be, once again, souring on Putin, as evidenced by his decision to seize a Russian-flagged tanker and recent reports that he's greenlit a bill drafted by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham that would impose 500% tariffs on countries buying Russian oil. Trump's recent turn against Putin seems to be related to the Russian president's rather tall story about Ukraine launching tens of drones against one of his personal residences late last month, which the Kremlin framed as a Ukrainian effort to undermine peace negotiations. At the time, Trump seemed to believe Putin's account of the attack, telling reporters he was, quote, very angry about it. However, a week later, after the CIA had come out to say they didn't think the attack actually happened, Trump walked back his previous comments, saying, "I don't believe that strike happened," implicitly suggesting Putin lied to him. Anyway, you get the point. At such a critical time for Ukraine, and with Trump apparently souring on Putin, at least some European leaders argue that Europe should basically do anything it can to keep the US on side, even if that means letting the US seize Greenland. However, other European leaders think Europe needs to at least push back a bit. They argue that Europe needs to defend Greenland for principled reasons. After all, an American attempt on Greenland would be both a violation of Europe's territorial integrity and international law more generally. But there are also more pragmatic reasons to push back. Most obviously, the past year or so has demonstrated pretty clearly that Trump only really responds to strength, and efforts to appease him usually lead to more pressure down the line. Comparing the Chinese and European experiences is instructive here. China has retaliated against Trump at every turn, while Europe has generally tried to appease him. The Chinese strategy does seem to have worked better. Not only has China ended up making fewer concessions to the US, but the Trump administration also just seems better disposed towards China than Europe at the moment, which isn't necessarily what you'd expect, given that China has taken a more confrontational tone, while Europe has taken a more conciliatory one, to say nothing of the fact that Europe is supposed to be America's ally. You can see this in how Trump talks about Xi. He's constantly expressing admiration for the Chinese leader, and has recently described him as both a great leader and tough and smart. Conversely, Trump is constantly mocking European leaders. In a Politico interview last year, for instance, Trump described his European counterparts as weak, while Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth was quoted describing Europe as pathetic when his Signal group chat was leaked last year. You get the point. More hawkish European leaders argue that defending Greenland is the right thing to do, both morally and strategically. So if these leaders get their way, how could Europe retaliate? Well, the most dramatic move would be some sort of preemptive military deployment, in an attempt to deter Trump from trying his luck. This might sound far-fetched, but comments by European officials suggest it's on the table. Early last year, for instance, when Trump first talked about annexing Greenland, France offered to send troops to the territory. although it's hard to imagine a deployment being explicitly framed as an anti-American deterrence force. Rather, Europe would probably frame it as a way of addressing the Trump administration's concerns that Denmark and Europe don't take Greenland security sufficiently seriously. More recently, however, the Danish Defence Ministry warned that Danish troops would take a shoot first, ask questions later posture if US troops were to invade, in accordance with a 1952 standing order which requires Danish troops to, quote, immediately take up the fight without waiting for or seeking orders in the event of an attack on Danish territory. This directive was created in reaction to Nazi Germany's attack on Denmark in 1940, when communications partially collapsed and many Danish units subsequently didn't know whether they should fight back. Now, we've got to say, the idea of European troops actually shooting at American ones feels pretty unlikely. Rather, it'd probably be more of a Tiananmen Square type situation. They'd probably just try to get physically in the way, thus forcing any US troops to use violence in order to advance. Nonetheless, this would still be an incredibly risky strategy, with a real risk of conflict between European and American troops. If Europe thus decides a military deployment would be too risky, the other option is some sort of economic retaliation. The most obvious mechanism here would be the EU's new and as of yet unused anti-coercion instrument, sometimes dubbed the trade bazooka, which provides legal grounds for the EU to respond asymmetrically to economic coercion. This would allow the EU to whack big fines on American tech companies and exclude American firms from government contracts. A more extreme form of economic retaliation would be a coordinated dumping of US government bonds. For context, EU member states collectively hold something like $1.5 trillion worth of US government bonds, typically known as treasuries, with the UK holding an additional $700 billion. A mass sell-off of these bonds would wreak havoc in the treasury market and push up America's borrowing costs, which would be particularly bad news for an administration that is apparently hoping to boost defence spending by 50% next year. Again, this might feel far-fetched, but, well, Trump has taken the transatlantic alliance into uncharted territory, and Europe would do well to remember it has more cards at its disposal than is sometimes assumed. If you're interested in this, in the latest issue of our magazine, we discuss every major election that happened in 2025, running through races in Poland, Australia, Canada, Singapore, Germany, Japan, Norway, South Korea, the Netherlands, Argentina, Bolivia, Cameroon, Czechia, and Jamaica, helping you to catch up on stories you might have missed, as well as understanding the trends taking place around the world. There's so much more in this issue too. In addition to our cover story about the new Middle East, there's also full sections dedicated to UK, EU and global news. The EU section includes our interview with fellow creator Money and Macro, where we discuss how to fix the European economy, Macron's fall from grace, and how Albania has implemented an AI minister. The global section discusses why Trump's mandate isn't quite what it seems, how politicians conquered social media, plus our election summary I just mentioned. And our UK section runs through the rise of the new left, why this year's elections are critical at all levels, as well as the strategies Starmer ought to take to maintain power, and Farage to gain power. Subscribers to Too Long automatically get 20% off every copy as long as they stay subscribed. But as a special New Year offer, you can get an additional 30% off your first issue if you use the code at checkout.